Today I'm going to show you how to change the brakes on a Ram 1500. This is a 2014, but this also applies to other years as well. Now, I'm only going to be doing the rear brakes and not the front for a couple of reasons. The front ones don't need done, first of all, and then the second reason is once you learn how to do the rear brakes, the front ones will be a piece of cake, basically. The reason for that is the rear rotors have an kind of a trick to them to get off it sometimes, not all the time, but occasionally they can be tricky. There's lots of videos on how to change the brakes on Ram 1500, but I haven't found any that actually address the issue of a rotor getting stuck on the emergency brake pad sometimes. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you here today in particular. So look out for that if you're having issues with that particular aspect of changing your brakes. So let's go ahead and get this thing jacked up. I already have it in four-wheel drive so the front tires won't move, and I'll get this jacked up and secured, then we'll start disassembly. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the caliper, and I do that by removing these two bolts, this one here and there's one at the bottom as well. Okay, with a 10mm socket we're going to remove these two bolts I talked about. A little bit corroded, but very reusable. Now, next thing I'm going to do is take this caliper off, and it might take some finagling to do this, to get this out of here. It's not bad. And then I suspend it. I'll just put it on the stabilizer bar here. Try not to kink the hose too much. We're left with the brake pads and the caliper bracket here that we also need to remove. I'm thinking though, before I do that, I'm gonna take these brake shoes off. And they just slide out of place. Okay, I'm also going to pop these brackets off. The brake pads come with new brackets, of course. Once that's done, I have to take off this caliper bracket here. Now we have a couple of 21mm bolts here that need to be removed. And you might need a little extra help with these because they have thread locker in place. Okay, that comes off easily enough. Okay, now that we have the bracket off, it's time to remove the rotor. Now, if this is the first brake job on this vehicle, you may notice this little lock washer on here. So I need to get this off of here next, and it should just unscrew on that thread. And the other one unscrewed perfectly, and this one isn't moving, unfortunately. Okay, I got it to stick up a little bit. And now, I'm just going to try to bend it. It's really thin. Get that thing to come off of there. I'm just going to get a pair of wire cutters here and work on this until I get this thing to let go here. This is a part that I was referring to that can be kind of tricky when taking the rear brakes off of a Ram 1500, and that is they use a hybrid drum disc brake style. And of course this is used for everyday driving, and then the parking brake is actually a drum setup, and on the inside are brake shoes, just like any other drum brake. What happens is sometimes you get a rusty lip that builds up. Especially in the Northeast here with the salt, you get a rust ridge that builds up on the inside of this drum, and it won't let you take this rotor past the brake pads. So you don't take a sledgehammer and start pounding on it, although I've read some people do that and eventually get it off. It's probably not the best thing. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we have to make sure the rotor's actually loose from the axle itself. Sometimes they get corroded and they actually stick to the axle. what I did with the other one that works, now everyone has their own way, but I have a small pry bar here that I stick in between the casting here, where the bracket mount, and I push on the rotor, and I just gently pull on it, and I'm seeing here that the rotor isn't actually stuck on the axle at all. It moves. It moves, but the rotor is stuck on the brake shoes. You can actually move this rotor a little bit. Next thing we have to do is adjust the emergency brakes all the way in. Bring the pads all the way in. Now this is set up like you would have on electric trailer brake. It uses a star wheel adjustment on the inside of the hub. So you have to adjust it all the way back using that star wheel. Of course, make sure your parking brake is off, because there's no way you'll get the rotor off with the parking brake on, of course. You see right under here there's a grommet. I'm going to take this grommet out. Take that grommet out. It's not too difficult. You have to work at it a little bit, and it pops out of place, and there'll be an adjustment hole there. Now what you want to do is take a flat blade screwdriver, put it in the adjustment hole, and turn that star wheel now. Once you get the brake shoes backed off, the brake rotor, you'll find, should come right off. In the middle of the screen is the star wheel. Now I'll give you some idea of what you're dealing with when you poke that screwdriver through the adjustment hole. It's not the best star wheel I've seen. As far as I'm concerned, the edges are too rounded. If you work with trailer brakes, they usually have more of a pronounced groove in them, so you actually know the screwdriver's going where it's supposed to. These ones are kind of tricky, but they do work, of course, and that's what you need to adjust to adjust the brake shoes back. Here are the brake shoes, and this is the part here that gets caught on the rusty lip on the drum. Here is the rear rotor, and it looks a lot better than the other one. Now, the only thing I'm going to do before I mount this truck is I'm going to degrease it, these areas here anyway, because you don't want oil touching the brake pads, because it'll screw it up. And here's the drum surface, all nice and shiny at this point. In a couple years this will build up with rust and whatever. The next thing I'm going to do now is spray some brake cleaner on here and take the manufacturing oil off of here, the anti-rust oil. Clean that off real quick. I'm going to keep doing that until the rag doesn't get dirty anymore. Okay, at this point we can start reassembly. If there's any spots of oil I might have gotten on there, I'll just wipe that off. Now we can start reassembling the caliper. Okay, that's back on. Now we need to put the clips on. Now these clips here aren't symmetric. They're a little bit off center, so you have to line them up appropriately here. Let's see if I can find which way. I'm going to lubricate the brackets a little bit with some of this brake grease right here, very, very lightly. You don't want it melting off, melting and leaking onto the brake pad, so I'm putting just a thin film on there just to keep the brakes from squeaking. Next I'm going to put the brake pads on. They just slide onto these little clips here. Okay, we're ready to put the caliper back on the mounting bracket. Before I can do that, I had to push the piston back into place so it'll fit over these new pads since they're thicker. Now I realize I'm telling a lot of you guys stuff you already know, but this is for the benefit of people who haven't been through this before, so don't feel insulted, by this information. Sometimes you can push these in by hand. I can't. On the left hand side I could, this one I can't, so I'm going to show you something else I do here. Here's the bleeder, and there's the boot on the bleeder. I'm going to slide that boot off there and put a piece of tubing on here. Now the reason for the tubing is whenever I retract this piston, some fluid is going to come out, and if this piston goes back in a little bit, it might suck air in, and I don't want air in the caliper. So I'm just going to loosen this up a little bit. Just crack it open slightly. Just a little tiny bit. And then I'm going to put a clamp on here. A C-clamp with a metal block so I don't damage the piston. I'm just going to push that piston back into place. And as I do that, you'll see the fluid go out of the tube there. Now you notice the fluid's a little bit dirty, so I used the bleeder to drain out that fluid because I didn't want to push dirty fluid back up into the brake lines. A little trick that some garages use is to actually put a pair of vice grips on the brake line and squeeze that off while they're doing this to prevent it going up there. Unfortunately, what they do sometimes is collapse the brake line, and then you need new brake lines, and I don't really appreciate that practice, but some people do it. Anyway, at this point I'm going to close the bleeder off again slightly and then take the clamp off. Now once you get that on there, you want to reinstall the bolts. These bolts here that were slightly corroded. I put a little bit of that silicone brake grease on there before I reinstalled them. Now the one thing you don't want to forget to do after you get all this installed is to readjust that star wheel. Now you need to, what you want to do is adjust that star wheel until this won't move anymore. Then you'll know the brakes are locked up. Now then what you do is you just adjust the star wheel the opposite way to loosen it back up just until this starts to rotate again and you don't hear any kind of excessive drag. It's kind of hard to tell anyway, but just loosen it up until these don't, till this spins freely again. Now I've adjusted it till the rotor won't turn anymore. So I'm going to back it off a little bit. There, it turns freely again. So the emergency brakes are adjusted at this point. I'm gonna bleed this a little bit more out here. Make sure there's no air in there. I'm just gonna open that valve up and let some brake fluid come out. Make sure there's no air bubbles. I'll tap it a few times to dislodge any air bubbles that might have been in it, but we really didn't have an opportunity to allow air into this caliper. So, okay, I'm not seeing any air at all. So I'm going to tighten that back up. Take the tube off and put the rubber boot back on. Now the only other thing I do is I go over this surface here with a real fine flat file to make sure there's no raised edges or burrs or oxidation that might interfere with the mounting the wheel. And then I add some of this stuff too. This is for electrical connections in a breaker box. Now this might be overkill, but this will prevent the aluminum from oxidizing when it's up against steel. And that's how I change the brakes on my Ram 1500.